Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar on PCNs. If this is your first time on the Medics Money webinar, then I'd like to welcome you all. My name is Dr. Tommy Perkins, and I'm a GP, and I'm also one half of Medics Money. And the other half of Medics Money is my colleague, Dr. Ed Cantelo, who's also a GP, but before doing medicine, Ed was, or still is, a chartered accountant and chartered tax advisor. And we run Medics Money together because we wanted to empower doctors and other healthcare professionals to know more about their finances. And we do that in a variety of ways, by content on our website and by webinars. And we've got a podcast now as well. And we cover the whole spectrum from F1 to GP and consultant and beyond, practice managers, everything. So that's a bit about what we do. We also have a network of 38 of this country's best specialist medical accountants, financial advisors, and mortgage advisors. And tonight we are going to be hearing from RBP, who are part of that network, and Rob Day. So I'll introduce those guys in a minute. But before we get going, it'd be great if, while everyone's just filing in, if we could jump in the chat and introduce ourselves. And are you a GP? Are you a practice manager? Are you a PCN director? And tell us one thing that you're hoping to learn from tonight, because after about 20 minutes of the presentation, I will be jumping in with some questions from you guys from the chat. So introduce yourself in the chat, one thing you want to learn, and if you've got any questions, just jump in the chat. And my colleague Ed, who I mentioned, he's also in the chat, and we've got some other people in the chat who I'm sure will introduce themselves. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to introduce myself in the chat, and I'll see you all there. And then I'll introduce our speakers for the evening. And yeah, thanks for coming. And there's Ed jumping in already. So I'm just jumping in the chat. I think Ed was on call today, so he's done well to finish an on-call day and get back home in time to start the webinar. Hopefully not too many of you have been on call because... Hi, Sylvia. Nice to see you. So good. So we got some things going on in the chat. So definitely take your time to. We've got Adoli. Hi, Dolly. Hi, Craig. Craig is clinical director of a large PCN in Islington. Good to have you in. What do you define as large, Craig? Are you saying 100,000, or be interesting to know? Hi, Angela. Nice to see you. Angela's a GP as well. Good. Anita, another GP. Have we got any PMs in here tonight? Be good if we had some practice managers. Craig, 100,000 or so for the large. Yep, that is a large PCN. I'm only asking because I'm part of a fairly large PCN as well. So it's interesting to know what other people have done and what their experiences are. All right, great. Hi, Deb. A PCN project manager from South Gloucestershire. Hopefully the weather's better in South Gloucestershire than it is where I am, which is south of Chichester, because it's raining pretty hard. Hi, Sham. Sham's come to learn about how PCNs have done around the country. Sheetal is a practice manager. Sheetal, yes, practice manager. We like that. Another PM, Amy. Hi, Amy, deputy PM. Great. Okay, so if you keep the questions going and what you want to learn in the chat, that will really help us to tailor tonight's talk to your needs. But I think you've probably heard enough from me, and it's time to bring in the experts for this evening. So Katie, do you want to turn on your camera and introduce yourself to everybody?
Hello, everyone. I'm Katie Singer. I actually just was quickly in the chat and I could see some names that I recognise and some friendly faces I know watching me, so hello. Tommy did briefly say, but my name's Katie Singer. I'm a partner at RBP, so we're a medical specialist accountants. We're based in London. We act for around 250 GP practices, mainly in the London area, but also in the outside. We also, just because of the change in setups, as you guys know, that's why you're all here, have currently probably about 25 to 30 PCNs that we're acting for. That number is increasing on pretty much a weekly basis. And as Rob and I go through our discussions later, you know, it has gone, the PCNs have changed from not necessarily needing accountants who people thinking things are changing, we need to get one. So we are seeing them come through more and more. Just something that I'll mention, Tommy's already talked about the chat, so I've turned it off because I think it might be a bit distracting. But I know and I hope that my fellow partners from RBP, so if you see their names pop up, we've got Jenny, Kate and Stuart Singer. If they're in the chat, they might, if you are asking questions throughout, they might be able to answer some of them as they go along, just to keep that chat interactive. I know the last few times I've been on one of these Money Medics webinars, the chat's been amazing, really. So hopefully that'll be the same tonight. So guys, please just ask as many questions as you can, and then anything that can't get answered, hopefully myself or Rob can answer as we go through and start taking some questions. So I am going to introduce Rob. So Rob Day is joining us today. Hopefully he's going to turn on his camera now. No technical glitches. There he is. Rob is joining us from Mills Reeve, a legal firm based in, well, his department is based in London, and he heads up the primary care sector network department, should I say. And he will tell us all a little bit about himself. And then what we'll do is we've got a list of sort of pre-prepared questions that were just general sort of hot topics that are constantly asked of us, of myself, asked of Rob, that we're going to cover. And then, as we say, we'll open up the floor whenever it's appropriate for questions from you guys. So I'll just let Rob take over now and say a little bit about himself.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. Evening all. So my name is Rob Day. As Katie said, I head up the primary care team at Mills Reeve Solicitors. So as a firm, we have 6 offices throughout the country. I'm supposedly based in London. That is my base office, but given the work we do, it's generally across England that we work with GPs, networks, etc. In terms of, it's probably why I'm here tonight. I do a lot of work with PCNs, and prior to joining Mills Reeve, I was at the BMA, so I was within the BMA's legal team and also their legal service provider, BMA Law. So I was heavily involved with the introduction of PCNs when they first were a brainchild, if you like, of NHS England.
Excellent. So we're just going to get stuck straight into the questions, and obviously, hopefully some back and forth discussion. So the first one that we get asked, or you probably get asked the most, is how many PCNs have you been involved with? And can you tell us a bit more of your involvement with them?
Yes, so I'd probably say over the last year and a half, we've been involved with working with about 50 to 60 PCNs across the country. In terms of the sorts of work that we've been asked to support with, I mean, it's sort of changed as time's gone on. I think everybody will probably agree that there was a rush to set up initially, given the speed at which it was introduced. But as time's gone on, focus has been more towards, you know, how can we now operate? What are we going to do going forward in the future? How can we structure ourselves to take advantage of opportunities and potentially to mitigate some of the sort of concerns that people have with PCNs, be that liabilities, VAT, and whatever it may be. As sort of alluded to in the introduction, I was supporting the BMA when it came to negotiating certainly the mandatory front-end part of the network agreement as it was being released, and also feeding into the network contract DES. That's the first year network contract DES.
Yeah, actually, that was the second question. So your particular involvement in the PCN network DES, can you give us a bit more information about how it is, you know, moving going forward? What will you know?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to say
you know more.
Yeah, I'd love to say I do know. I mean, I think if I'm honest, I think the changes that were proposed last year in relation to the network contract DES were quite a surprise to everybody. So NHS England obviously went out for consultation in terms of the proposed changes to the DES specification. And I think it caught everybody by surprise at the extent and scope to which they were looking to change the specification. Clearly, that led to a complete fallout of people saying they wouldn't sign up to this. And so they had to rein in effectively what they were looking to do. So I think all I can say with that is we've already seen that they've changed quite significantly in a year, and I expect that they will continue to change quite significantly going forward. Now, whether that change is directed nationally or whether that's a change that is driven by the networks themselves remains to be seen. I've got high hopes that it will be the latter. As I said, I'm starting to see networks now go to a position where actually they're leading and driving change, regardless of what's going on nationally.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Now, I know, and you mentioned it in your intro, that you were involved heavily with the BMA, and I know, I don't know if all our viewers will know, that you were involved with some of the templates for creating the sort of standard network agreements. But one of the questions I had, or I get asked, is, as a PCN, we need a network agreement? And what if we don't have one? Because I know that there are PCNs out there that haven't taken any kind of legal advice at all.
Yeah, okay. So it's a good point. I think the word of caution with the templates that were prepared at the time is those templates were put in place to almost overcome an initial stage in the development of PCNs. Right. So if we rewind when PCNs first came into existence, everybody had a set period of time in which they had to sign up to say that they wanted to be involved within a network. And as part of that requirement, they also had to submit Schedule 1 of the network agreement. So the template looked at just addressing Schedule 1 of the network agreement, which covered, who's your nominated payee, who's the clinical director, how were they appointed, and decision making. Beyond that, it didn't cover the more intricate arrangements about how each individual PCN was going to operate. So in answer to the question, is it important? Yeah, it is very important. The best thing I can say is PCNs are not a legal entity in their own right. They're a contractual joint venture between the practices that make up those networks. So effectively, imagine that you were a partner in a partnership. You would enter into a partnership agreement. So, taking that to a different and using that as an analogy, effectively, each constituent practice is a partner within their PCN, and they need to sign up to some document governing their working relationships with one another. And that's where the network agreement comes in. Really important document. It covers things such as decision making, as we said, profits, losses, how liabilities are split, how service provision is split, workforce arrangements, the full remit of what you'd expect any JV contract to cover, joint venture contract to cover, would be in the network agreement.
Yeah, I'm glad you've mentioned all of that, because I know that there will, hopefully a lot of the people who are watching do know all this stuff, but there will be people out there who are I know I've had experience, obviously I'm not going to single anyone out, but I've had experience where PCNs are operating and they aren't really operating as we would anticipate they should. Whilst they're not a separate legal entity, they are sort of a separate standalone little, club, if you like, that really should create a separate set of accounts and create, separate documentation so that it can be transparent with all the members. And I know that not all PCNs are operating in that way. And there is a concern, I think, sometimes when all the parties of the PCN don't actually know what's going on. So I think a network agreement is really, really, really important. So if anyone's watching today who doesn't have one or hasn't spoken to anyone about it, they really, really should. Well, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, what we tend to find is actually they're doing it in practice. It's just it's not necessarily recorded in a document. So it's just about creating that, the arrangements, the contractual arrangements to support what you're doing.
Agreed. Okay, so we'll move on to the next question. So how have you seen PCNs develop over the last 18 months?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, that one. I mean, it's probably the reason why a lot of people are actually on this webinar. Now, again, what was mentioned is everybody rushed to set up these networks initially. So they were desperately putting in place network agreements. They were establishing effectively open communications with their colleagues, and some of which had never really worked with each other before. So, a lot of it was about bedding down the relationships and the agreements governing those relationships. But as time's gone on, what we've tended to find is actually PCNs are now becoming far more active and far more engaged as to, not only looking at what they're doing now and making sure that that's properly covered off, but also considering what they're going to do in the future. So if I were to say what my usual sort of list of day-to-day inquiries are when it comes to PCNs, I would say, yes, it's network agreements, but more and more now we're seeing conversations around the necessity to have subcontracting arrangements in place with third parties that maybe employ staff on behalf of the network or deliver on a specific aspect of the DES. And also, we're seeing a lot of PCNs turn to the possibility of creating provider arms amongst themselves. So in essence, creating their own little mini corporate vehicle to deliver and drive the network going forward.
And I think I know because I've read the questions beforehand that we are definitely going to move on to certain topics that will hopefully cover that in a bit more detail. Okay, so next we've got, what have been the main changes around the governance and how have you most commonly seen them being implemented?
Yeah, so in relation to this question, what I'd say is I think is really indicative of, not in all cases, but in certain cases where people were relatively nervous about primary care networks and their ability to have a say in how things were run and wanted to be fully involved in their development. So what we tended to find is that there was almost a default position where everybody was involved. So when it comes to governance, you're talking about how decisions are taken and how the PCN is operated. But as times sort of moved on, and whether that's because people have got more comfortable with the with their colleagues, or whether it's because they've just got bored of dealing with that, I suspect maybe the latter. But what you tend to find now is actually you're moving from a situation where everybody is involved to a much more sort of fluid arrangement whereby there's an executive committee, which is, consists of a few individuals that don't necessarily need to be the clinicians from practices or the contractors from practices. They could be HR leads, finance leads, practice managers. And they're in charge of really driving the day-to-day running of the PCN. And they have, by reference of the terms of sort of operation, they have a set of limits in their scope of what they can and can't do. So, for instance, an obvious one in recent arrangements we put in place is a wraparound spend, which the executive committee can spend without further reference back to all of the members. But even then, when we're talking about all members, what we tend to find is that we're not talking about everybody sitting in a room. You're talking about individual representatives from each of the members. So if you were to tree that, you would effectively have everybody, so all contractors. They would then nominate representatives to sit on a PCN board, for instance, and then there would be a higher executive committee that's just in charge of day-to-day running. Any key decisions are then referred back down to the representatives to take, just so there's, those flows of oversight and control.
Yeah. Excellent. That sounds really, you put it in such a logical way. I know that in practice, I think, how you've said a few times that it had to, the PCNs had to move very quickly in the early days. I can't even remember, I think it was January 2019 we first heard of them, or maybe February 2019. And then it was May, was that the deadline where you had to sign up? I can't remember exactly the dates, but it was a very short time frame to be able to choose your PCN. I say choose. I know from experience that I've had practices say that they wanted to be with one group and it was rejected, and they may have moved around PCNs during the time. I've had practices tell me that they were the lead practice and now they're no longer the lead practice. So it is changing, and so it's good to hear that the structures are starting to come into play more of a instead of a chaotic structure, just more logical. It's definitely better, definitely will work better. Oh, we've got Tommy.
I was going to say, would this be a good time to just jump in with some questions that are coming in thick and fast in the chat?
Sure,
I know you guys
I'm really glad to hear that.
Cool. So the first one, I think this is probably more for Rob, is from Dr. Ola, who says, is there any difference between a newly formed PCN and a pre-existing super partnership? Good question, Ola.
Well, other than PCNs are effectively the practices that would have taken the network contract DARES, the super partnership itself is a distinct body in the sense of it's usually one partnership. Now, whether that operates multiple practices, and that may well be the case, but what you tend to find is with a super partnership, there's at least one common, partnership, an organisation, whereas PCN is made up of far more different constituent parts. So you could have completely different members of a PCN, whereas a super partnership, they've generally chosen to be together. I say generally, and they're usually all in one partnership.
Okay, cool.
Hopefully, that might come in later about that is when we talk about different structures. One of the structures is almost being, Rob will say more, is being operated through, potentially through like a network or through a federation. And I know of experience that there are PCNs operating through super practices. And I know super practices could often have 3 or 4 PCNs within that super practice. So we're getting sort of a bit muddled. But I think the two are separate, but essentially you could have multiple PCNs within a super partnership or a super practice, if you want to call it.
The questions are coming in real thick and fast. There's 2 more being added since I said we are going to do questions. Wow. So sorry about this, but I think it's good to get these done in now because it's relevant to what we just talked about. So Craig is asking, as I recall, Craig is the head of a 100,000 PCN. Yeah. Are you able to comment on section 7 of the agreement about adding in partners? Do you have any advice on how to word this schedule if bringing in secondary care? That sounds like an interesting project you've got going on there, Craig, anyway. But yeah, what's that question? Rob, is that for you?
Yeah, I know the reason that Craig's asking it, and that's because everybody's been forced to sign up to or include details within Schedule 7 of their network agreement. A lot of CCGs are possibly getting the wrong idea as to what Schedule 7 should do. Now, I think my advice with that is take extreme care, because I've seen some of the pro formas that have been released and issued by CCGs to enter into. Now, rewind back to a situation where we were actually talking about a network agreement. The aspiration of NHS England is you would have one agreement, everybody would sign up to this one agreement. There'd be, your core network practices and other members, and it would all be covered off in the network agreement. But that's just not feasible. It's just not feasible because you will be working with multiple organizations. Some will have very limited involvement in the network as a whole. So to have them sign up to your network and be a party to your network agreement just seems illogical. So if I were to give recommendations with that, if the third parties that you're working with are not actually going to be involved in actually driving the PCN forward, or you want them to have a say, I would refer to them in Schedule 7 in the sense that you're going to operate and work with these third parties, but have a separate standalone agreement with them covering the terms applicable to how you're going to work with them. Don't think if you sign off on the templates that I've seen, and I'm just second guessing what you may have been provided, don't think but just by filling in the details that have been provided with you, that's going to be sufficient, because it covers no terms as to how you're going to work with one another. So, how fees are going to be handled, termination provisions, the term of the arrangement, VAT, all of those points. So yeah, hopefully that answers that.
Yeah, Craig's already said thanks. That's a really helpful answer. Someone's just sent me a private message about, can we have a CPD certificate for that? What I'm going to suggest is if Emma drops her email in the chat and liaise with Emma, because that's a great idea. Like, get some CPD now that appraisal and revalidation have restarted. Like, log CPD. Okay. So just drop Emma, drop her email in the chat, and we'll sort that out. Deborah Gadd says, can you see in the future more funding coming to help with the infrastructure and IT of having the additional roles in practices?
I can. I think one positive of COVID has probably been the drive and push towards technology, and already that we're seeing a marked increase in digital functionality when it comes to triaging of patients. Now, where money is going to be directed in the future will be via PCNs. I think NHS England has set their stall out there, and I think it would make sense for them, if they wanted to push funding via the network contract DES, if they're looking to further, drive digital change. But, from their perspective, they're probably sitting back and thinking, well, this is great. In our minds, this is going to take another 10 years to do. Look at what's happened in 10 days. So, I wouldn't expect, massive changes along that. It's certainly my view anyway.
Cool. Shamir, I think we're answering your question as we go through, but let me know if not. Sylvia is asking about structure of PCNs and VAT. We're literally about to do that. So, sit tight with that one, Sylvia. I'm just scrolling through. There's quite a few questions here. Okay, Shitao is saying, any news if NHS England will be sending direct transfers for PCN DES funds direct to PCN bank accounts and not via the CCG?
I haven't heard. I don't know. I thought you were going to ask the question whether it would it could go to a PCN bank account as opposed to a practice bank account. I thought that was what the question was going to be, but I don't know on that one, I'm afraid.
Are we going to talk about that second bit in a bit, right? About where the funds should go?
No, I only to say at the moment, I haven't heard that things have changed on that front. But okay. I think as time goes on, it would make sense because, the way PCNs are developing is they are becoming far more organised, and certainly if they create their own provider arms that are own distinct bodies, you could well imagine that funding would be directed directly to them.
Cool. Okay. Keep the questions coming. I'm going to jump back into the chat and let you guys carry on. This is really interesting. So keep going.
Okay, so next question. So as accountants, we're commonly discussing, and I mean, all the PCNs we act for, use the lead practice model. So that's the model that most of the people listening potentially might be aware of. But can you just run us through the other models and, which one you think is the best fit and maybe whether that's changing?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I don't think the models in terms of how PCNs can operate has changed, and I don't think it necessarily will change, certainly not in the foreseeable future. So as you said, you've got the lead practice model being, and just to recap, effectively where one practice fronts the contractual commitments on behalf of the PCN as a whole. Now, lead practice models are, one of, if not the most common model at the moment. It certainly was at the outset. And in such models, really, the care that needs to be taken is really around how that lead practice's liabilities are then shared as amongst the other members. And that's where the network agreement again comes into play. That's where you would record that. Leaving that aside, the other model, as we know, is the flat contracting model. So in essence, all constituent practices would sign up to contracts, so whether that's employment contracts, albeit a flat contracting model when it comes to employment sends shivers down lawyers' spines. It's great from a VAT perspective. I'm sure you'll say it's great from a VAT and accountancy perspective, but lawyers hate it. And we hate it simply because imagine that there's a dispute with an employee, everybody gets pulled into that dispute. and managing
is that sort of where, because we had, when we were in the early days, we were as accountants pretty unsure of how we were going to advise on certain elements that we were asked about, and one of them very often was who is responsible. And so something that we were told about more so by sort of the accountancy that side was consider joint employment contracts. But if you say those words to a lawyer, or you'll tell me, they just hate them. They just say no. Is that what you're alluding to, that the flat, it just doesn't really, I mean, it's there, but it doesn't really work.
Well, I think it's pretty indicative of really the way the DES was introduced and the speed it was introduced at the outset. And the thing is a solution on one hand has a knock-on effect somewhere else. And it wasn't particularly fully thought through, particularly with VAT. And I think, if we weren't talking VAT, no one would do a flat contracted model. It's just pointless to do. But, because we have got those issues, you have people that are looking and thinking, okay, well, we need to put something in place to address it. But the flat contracting model, aside, and going back to the other models, you've got the use of third parties. So we talked about subcontracting. So, there may be many on the webinar that use Age UK. I see them quite regularly as a subcontractor that delivers elements of the DES. And really the last one we see is, I say third parties. I go back to using third parties. Also, trusts, local trusts, GP federations. And the last thing we see is, again, a new thing. It's really the creation of, their own provider arm. So creating their own almost mini GP federation amongst themselves to drive and deliver the PCN DES and also to hold the contracts. But what I'd say is that if anybody's listening to this, you shouldn't be stuck on one model. What's really important is fluidity when you're dealing with operating the DES. For one aspect, you may think actually our appetite is that we want to keep this in-house. So we want to keep this within the PCN. So we're going to employ this member of staff. We're going to deliver this element of the service. Whereas on another, you may think actually we haven't got the expertise, the time, or the inclination to deal with this, so we're going to use a third party. And really the decisions around what you do there is to do with really what you want to keep internally, and really what your risk appetite is like. It's okay saying actually we want to employ the whole remit of the 25 individuals that we're going to fall within the ARRS scheme, but are you comfortable about the risk that brings? To the extent that you're not, then you can start to look at other models. But you're not set in stone, and that's an important thing. You can employ one individual via a lead practice model. You can subcontract another element. So you can do a mix.
Well, that's interesting. And I hadn't really considered that, to be honest, before you mentioned it. So, and I think the people that are listening today, I don't think many of them, well, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but would have also thought that. I think we were under the assumption that you sort of picked a structure or a way of doing it, and that was how you had to continue on. So it's interesting to know that things can be, as I guess the PCNs grow and develop and change, so will the transitions, I guess. So leading on from the provider arm, what would the pros and cons of having such a separate vehicle be, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, a lot on that is going to depend on what's provider arm or third internal provider arm that you create. I think I could go through the full list. You could create an LLP, so limited liability partnership. You could create a company limited by guarantee, a company limited by shares. You could create another partnership as amongst yourselves. But generally what we're finding is that most people that are considering this are looking at this by reference to a company, a limited company of some sort. So when you're dealing with that, the pros and the cons, they're quite well recorded already. So the pros of a limited liability vehicle are, for obvious reasons, it has limited liability status. So your liabilities as shareholders in that company are limited to the amount that you put into the shares, so the nominal value of the shares, and anything else you may have put into the company in terms of an injection of capital. Other than that, it's limited in terms of its liability status. The next pro is that any limited liability vehicle is its own legal personality. What that means is effectively it's got the ability to enter into its own contractual arrangements with third parties. So, for instance, it would have the ability to enter into a contract with a member of staff or with a provider of a service. So if you were looking to subcontract, for instance, it could be the party that subcontracts that's involved in that subcontracting arrangement. And really, I suppose the last benefit of having sort of a limited liability vehicle, and it's sort of going to be thrown back at you a bit, Katie, with that, is that we're seeing these vehicles be used and set up as something called cost-sharing groups. And specifically, they're being set up that way in order to overcome the problems that PCNs are seeing when it comes to VAT. So, maybe you can talk a bit on that, put you on the spot.
Jumped ahead to one of my questions, but so just as a caveat, as medical specialists, we never really were involved with the issue of VAT. So for those of you watching, especially those that are GPs themselves or in a practice, in a partnership, you'll know that other than potentially if you're a dispensing practice, you don't have any involvement with VAT because the supply of medical services is outside of the scope of that. So if your turnover or your income goes over the VAT threshold of 85,000, you aren't affected by it because all of your income is a medical service until we've come into effect with PCNs. And now we're talking about, are we providing a medical service exempt from VAT, or are we supplying staff? And I guess this is where the issue comes in with VAT. Are we sharing staff, and therefore the supply of staff is a VAT-able expense? So by setting up a limited liability entity or a limited company, you would automatically, essentially, all of the shareholders would be part of this cost sharing group. You could share staff between your member practices with there being no VAT implications. And I know there have been numerous conversations, and if there's, other practices with other accountants, they will know that accountants have tried to come up with as many different solutions as possible. I know in the early days we were having conversations, should we set up limited companies just for the cost element? So that the PCNs would just transfer the cost element into the limited company so that not all of the income went into the limited company, because of course if all of the income goes in, then there could be other issues such as pension, which I think you're going to come on to shortly. But it's not just the VAT issue that would be, so if we can solve the VAT issue through a limited liability, through a limited company, but that would potentially open the door for other issues, like you said earlier, with the multiple contract agreements, with the staff agreements, multiple employment agreements. It band-aids over one issue and then opens up another one. And I think that's unfortunately the issue we had in the very early days with limited companies, although we are thinking that things will probably develop that way as we go forward. You might agree. And actually that leads me on to my next question, which is, assuming we do see more of a move towards incorporation, what are going to be the key considerations from a legal perspective, the certain things that the limited company will need to consider?
Yeah, I mean, before I do, because I obviously gave the pros, and it's.
Oh yeah, you didn't do the cons.
No,
sorry, I jumped ahead. I got so excited.
It's important to say the cons as well, because we can get wrapped up in saying, "Oh, these are great because of limited liability," but they do have drawbacks, and probably the main drawbacks is you'll probably know. The first one is it has set up and ongoing requirements and costs. So, setting up a corporate vehicle, putting in place all the shareholders agreements, articles, all of that's going to take time, and that's going to take costs. Going forward, you have to do annual returns. So whether that's annual accounts, whether that's, your confirmation certificate at Companies House. So, there's an ongoing requirement to maintain the company, which you wouldn't have ordinarily have. Other than that, some more practical sort of cons are really to do with, you are going to have to do, and I see a number, and this is more with GP federations. I haven't seen it with PCN provider arms as yet, but that's only because really the timescales are quite short at the moment. I've seen it with so many GP federations where members go. So in this instance, you'd have members of the PCN leaving, or there's a change in a partner that was a shareholder, but it's never been updated. So the shareholdings and the share structures of that turn into an absolute nightmare to try and resolve. So you have to keep on top of effectively the shareholdings within the companies itself. When members leave, when partners within a practice that are holding the share leave. So they're the sort of biggest cons within that element. And the last one is there's a necessity for directors. And those directors have codified statutory duties. So they've got to act by law in the best interest of the company, and those sorts of codified obligations apply automatically.
Which is why for us as accountants in the early days, we were like, just keep it as straightforward as possible. When it first started, we just didn't know how they were going to play out. So we thought, we'll keep it nice and basic. And then, you don't need to worry about, like you say, annual returns, Companies House, submitting the accounts to Companies House as well. So again, most of the people watching us, there might be GP partnerships or involved with GP partnerships, so they'll know that they don't have to submit their accounts to Companies House. They are just for themselves for their tax returns. Whereas if you have a limited company, they are submitted to Companies House and published and can be downloaded essentially.
Yeah, everything becomes publicly available. So, it's certainly things to bear in mind. I mean, in saying that, the articles of companies are publicly available, but your shareholders agreement, it's a bit like your partnership agreement. That's a private document. So there is some, privacy.
Some. Okay, so jumping back to the question that I jumped in on too early before we've been through the cons, it was basically just saying about what are going to be the key considerations from a legal perspective for the limited company.
No, this is a really important point. I think the first consideration is always to think, what is this? If you're going to consider putting in place this vehicle, what is it going to do, and what will it do in the future? Now, what I'm driving at there is primarily, is there ever going to be a possibility where this provider arm is going to itself hold a clinical contract? So will it hold a GMS or a PMS contract? Now, the reason I sort of say that is if the answer to that is yes, then you have to be very specific about the type of vehicle that you set up. So let's take GMS contracts, for instance. GMS contracts can only be held by individuals, so individual GPs, partnerships, or companies limited by shares, where the shares are held by a very specific or a specific list of individuals hold those shares. So, it goes to that point of don't just set something up without having any foresight of what it could potentially do. Now, certainly in my experience and our experience at Mills Reeve, we're seeing a lot of PCNs are looking at this as a potential port, to the extent that there's a storm with an individual practice that's looking to close, that it could be their provider arm that actually is the vehicle through which their GMS contract is subsumed. So what they're looking to do is have one eye on that as a possibility and set up their provider arm in such a way that they could, they could hold those clinical contracts. But other than that, I mean, the other considerations would be, and these are probably at the tip of everybody's tongue anyway, is first of all CQC. Will the provider arm itself be carrying out any regulated activities, or will it still be carried out by the individual practices themselves? Now, if there's a situation where actually this provider arm is carrying out regulated activities in its own right, then there may well be the necessity to register it with CQC. The next point is obviously going to be pensions. Is this provider arm going to employ members of staff? And usually the answer to that is a resounding yes. Why else are you going to set it up? It's usually set up for the purpose of holding the contracts for the additional roles. Now, if it is going to employ members of staff, they are likely to want access to the pension scheme. You know, it's a big benefit for anybody employed within the NHS. Now, if that's the case, most PCNs, unless they hold clinical contracts themselves, are unlikely to be able to access the pension scheme in their own right. Now, the solution that's been found, and it's almost a temporary solution at the moment, although it seems to be rolling over year on year, is that you can apply for a determination from NHS pensions, which effectively allows the provider arm access to the pension scheme for its staff members. The next considerations are probably more legal considerations. And they are, well, you're going to have to set up this company. You're going to have to put in place articles. You may put in place a shareholders agreement. The difference between the two, as mentioned, articles are a public document, shareholders agreement is a private document. But in essence, what they both do is set out the governing rules that will govern you as shareholders, or the shareholders within the provider arm. It will also set out the board structure, how decisions are going to be taken, etc. Other than that, the other key consideration is, where does this all sit in within the actual network itself? Now, it may well be the case that actually this provider arm then becomes, and going back to Craig's question earlier, it becomes a recorded member within your network agreement. It is actually featured as a member there, and it has an input in decision making, etc., going forward. And really, the other considerations, and it sort of links back to the VAT point, is if this is being set up as a cost sharing group, it has to be set up in a very, very specific way in terms of who holds the shares, and to make sure that you're effectively satisfying all the conditions required to take advantage of the exemption itself. So they're probably the core considerations, I'd say, bear in mind.
Brilliant. So we are on to our last question of the list of pre-prepared questions, but I haven't looked in the chat, but I'm guessing and hoping that there's some more. So I'll read the last question and then we'll bring Tommy back in to see if there's any more in the chat. So my final question is, how do you see PCNs developing further, and do you think they're here to stay?
I'm probably the wrong person to ask. I think you should be asking everybody in the chat. But I mean, my view on it is that, well, we know that they're here for 5 years at least. And I think what we're seeing is a real move by NHS England to use PCN as the vehicle through which it will pump money in terms of trying to deliver and address any issues that it sees within, within health provision. So I was reading a King's Fund sort of release recently when they were talking about mental health practitioners dropping in the additional role reimbursement scheme. Now, this was never really considered at the outset of PCNs, but it's an indicative step that actually PCNs are considered to be such an integral part of what they are trying to deliver, which is an integrated, care system at primary care geographical level. So, I do think they're here to stay. I mean, I think the biggest thing I would say and hope is that PCNs themselves, as I'm seeing, is actually they take the initiative, and whatever's going on nationally, they're actually really doing great things. I mean, it's remarkable at the speed at which they've been created to where we are today, and the things that they're doing. It's fantastic to see. And I think regardless of what goes on nationally, I think that will continue. The barriers between people working with one another historically seems to be dissipating quite quickly.
Yeah.
Awesome. I've got some more questions for you guys. Yeah. And if you're watching, I mean, this is a great chance to ask two absolute experts a question. So get your questions in. I was going to start from the top. So Sarah is asking, did you say that you can't hold a GMS contract if it's a company limited by guarantee?
Yeah, that's right.
So it has to be shareholding, can't be by guarantee.
Yeah, it has to be limited by shares, yeah.
Okay, hopefully that covers your question. Sylvia is asking, would they need to be CQC registered? I think this was the point we were talking about. Yeah.
It's whether they deal with regulated activities. But interestingly, as you know, some people may say that they're they're pretty useless, but actually my experience of dealing with CQC on this particular issue is they're actually quite helpful in the sense that they can give a steer as to whether they think yes or no you be separately registered.
You can never say that CQC are helpful in front of doctors or practice managers, like, oh, we're overdue our inspection. I was just like, don't say that again, please, Rob. It's very offensive to us. Okay, someone's private messaged me to say that you've already answered their question, which they had, so that's cool. I'm just scrolling the list. Keep them coming if you have any questions. But I think that was really great, so comprehensive that, as someone said in the private message, you've answered all of their questions. I'm scrolling. If you think I missed your question, can you bump it to the top? Because there's quite a lot of scrolling that's needed. We've had loads of questions, but I think you guys have answered them all.
Okay,
cool.
Great. I just wanted to finish up, just to say that, you know, from the accountancy side, you know, we've seen a massive shift from year one into year two, so we can see how big they're growing. We just want this whole VAT issue to be sorted out as soon as possible, because I think if the VAT, I think that's really, from an accountancy perspective, the biggest sticking point. I mean, Rob, you obviously have different legal issues, but that's our biggest, I don't want to say headache, but that's our biggest issue. And if that can hopefully be resolved or the best solution found, you know, there is so much potential and so much scope for everybody to be working together. So I'm glad that you've got a positive attitude about them.
It's not quite bedtime yet, you two,
oh,
because we do. Yeah, let's just we keep going for a bit more, if that's all right, because I'm aware that this is a great opportunity for people to ask two absolute experts questions. So I'm not sure if you might have covered this, but Nito was asking, does there have to be a legal agreement between the PCN and its member practices?
Well, the agreement between it would be the network agreement. So, you know, its member practices form the primary care network, which is effectively just a name, and the name that's given to that joint venture between those practices, and it's the network agreement that they sign up to. And the network agreement is, you know, I'm sure I'm teaching people that already know that. You have the front end part, which is mandatory set by NHS England. And you also have then the schedules, which are variable. And one thing I would say about that, which is, you know, disappointed with the way that DES moved this year, is everybody put in place their network agreement and all the schedules that went with it. And then they changed the DES this year, which had in various instances quite a big impact on the network agreement. And the most obvious one there is suddenly they introduced this opt-out of the DES. So, you know, there's no chance for members to leave, you know, even if you built it into your network agreement that says, actually, I want to hand you 6 months notice and I'm out of here. Yeah, it's just not going to work. You can't do it under the DES because there's this opt-out now. So, you know, once the specifications released year on year, you have 1 month to effectively turn around and say, I'm not happy with this, I'm walking away at the end of the year.
And another question from Deborah Gadd, who is saying, how do we deal with the states with ARR roles?
How do we deal with, sorry, I missed that, Tommy.
How do we deal with the states with ARR roles?
Estates, as in premises, are we talking there?
I'm thinking, given that Deborah asked about funding for IT and infrastructure earlier, I'm thinking she probably is talking about, maybe, Deborah, can you clarify that one a bit? Because don't worry, I've got a backup question. We'll do the backup question first. Deborah, would you mind just messaging me just to clarify? So, Rob, what do you need Deborah to clarify?
Yeah, I think Deborah's probably looking at premises because it's a big issue.
She's just said yes.
Okay. Yeah, it's a really tricky one because, you know, it's okay saying all these additional members of staff are going to, you know, you're going to employ them, but where are they going to sit within the network itself? Now, what we're seeing is two things really. One is certainly at the moment is there's no bespoke sort of locations which are being created for PCNs solely for PCN related staff. They're usually within their individual practice premises, which then comes on to, well, what are the terms relating to that? And generally what we're seeing is it's done on a license basis. So, these members of staff, particularly if they work within multiple practices, they're never usually there more than on an ad hoc basis. So what you tend to find is it's done on a license basis. And again, going back to, you can either build that within your network agreement, or you can have that as a side agreement as between the relevant practices to the extent it's relevant. But, if you lease your premises, usually what you're allowed to do is share space. So you should be okay.
Okay, I got a couple more. Azim is asking, how are estates managed in the PCN, and how can VAT be minimized by the PCN? So I reckon that's a question for you each there, right?
Yeah, so estates, I think it goes back to that point before. I think it's the same point as Deborah's one. I mean, I do think it's going to change. I do think it will change, because a lot of people are now starting to move towards this concept of, well, actually, can we get funding to build something or add something to our existing premises that's going to be specifically used given the increase in requirements coming under the DES? So I do think that's going to change, and you may well find in the future that actually there is specific hubs through which PCN activity is delivered. But certainly at the moment, we tend to find it's, again, done on these ad hoc license basis. There's nothing specific for, PCN related work.
Okay, I think maybe this will be the last one, but I said that twice already. Claire's asking a question that I want to ask as well. So, do you have any suggestions on how to manage hiring ARRS staff in the short term? Obviously, it'll take time to set up a limited cost sharing group. So would you recommend their employment contracts be with an individual practice or with the PCN?
Well, yeah, you're going to get two different views here. Now, from my perspective, first of all, does it matter if you're going to employ them in one way and then you're going to create a provider arm? And the answer to that is no. And the reason for that is, when you create your provider arm, you're likely to end up shifting service delivery and staff that go with that service delivery to your provider arm. So at that point, what actually takes place is there's a 2P transfer of staff. So effectively, it would move and hive into the provider arm. As to the interim arrangements, it depends. If you've got a practice that's actually quite comfortable taking the front of the contractual arrangements, I would always go for a lead practice model, but on the basis that you've got a robust network agreement behind the scenes, which shares the liabilities and costs between the other practices. And the reason for that, it's easy for me to say it without giving a reason, but the reason for that is exactly what I said. The lines of employee and employer are absolutely clear. You are my employee, I am your employer. If there's a problem, you come to me. It's my policies, my procedures, I pay you. It's clean, it's clear. Whereas with flat contracted models, you're pulling in multiple practices, multiple partners. It's not the individual practices that employ, it's the partners that employ.
Cool. So hopefully that answered your question, Claire. Nitil is asking, I think it's definitely for Rob, could a PCN employed healthcare professional take out a grievance against a member practice?
If they employ them, yeah, absolutely they could. Now, if they didn't, I struggle to see how they could. The only possible thing I could think of in those scenarios is, say they're operating from your practice premises and they're unsafe and something happens to them while they're there. So it's a bit like public liability. So say they trip or fall or something like that. You can imagine a claim in those instances, as you do expect any member of the public. But ordinarily, the employment claims would sit with the employing authority or practice in this instance.
Cool. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay, cool. Well, thanks so much, guys, for coming and making the chat so interactive and keeping these guys busy with your questions. Thanks so much to you, Katie and Rob, for that. That was super informative and great to take those questions.
Someone actually did ask, they said, I just, because I jumped in the chat and was just reading, they just said, can I be sent this webinar afterwards or will it be available? So I think you can resend it, can't you? And I know personally we're going to hope to save it and stream it on our YouTube channel, RBP's YouTube channel, which, is on our website if you need to take it. But are you going to send it? Can you send it around? You do normally, don't you?
Yeah, it goes out automatically after 1 day, and then you guys are going to put it on your YouTube. Emma's on top of that, so it'll be on YouTube real soon. So you can flick through and watch this instead of whatever else you watch on YouTube. Yeah, everybody's saying thanks to you guys. Really big thanks to you guys for taking the time out and juggling everything. And great. All right. Well, thanks for everyone coming, and Emma's just dropped her email in the chat. So any questions, emma@rbp.co.uk. Great. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, hope to see you guys on another webinar soon. Take care.
Sure. Bye, bye, bye.